Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm Ian Fisher. I'm going to be hosting the show for today. We've got a really nice show lined up for you. As we are heading more squarely into the summer, we're going to take some of your listener questions in our second and third segments, talking a little bit about your questions surrounding college admissions and financial aid. But before we do that, we want to continue our conversation around Pride Month and some of the interesting topics that are especially relevant for LGBTQ students and their college and college financial aid search. Joining us for today is the Vice President for Enrollment at the St. John's College, which actually has two campuses, one in Annapolis and one very beautiful campus out in Santa Fe. And his name is Benjamin Baum. Ben, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm really delighted to have you. Our producer, Jen, brings you, very highly recommended. She also said, I'm not allowed to drill into you about St. John's at this time. Maybe we'll have you back later to talk about that. But as a graduate of Reed College, the curriculum at St. John's is very near and dear to my heart. But what we're going to talk about today is the college search for LGBTQ students. And I wanted to just open up with a fairly broad question, which is, for students who identify as belonging to the LGBTQ community, how does the college search process differ, especially in the early phases? Are there certain things that students tend to be more aware of or need to be more aware of as they're starting to think about that next step in the college process? I wonder if you could let our listeners in on what your experience has told you there.
Yeah, that sounds like a simple question, but frankly, I could spend the entire segment just answering that one. And the answer is it depends, of course.
Of course.
So much, I think, on our own identities and what we're looking for in the right fit for ourselves and related to those identities in the colleges we're searching for. And so, there are many students for whom they might identify as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, and their search process might be very similar to someone else who doesn't identify with that community. For others, though, it could be really integral to the process. And some examples of this might be a student who is really searching for a place they know they're going to find a supportive community. Many colleges all around the country, and yet they're looking for a particular center. They're looking for a particular dating pool that will be large enough for them. They're looking for resources to support them. And that might vary if you identify as gay versus if you identify as transgender. And so really assessing your own needs and thinking about how those are going to manifest in the college admissions process and in the experience you want at the college you're going to, that's going to be the starting point.
Identity is a very interesting idea, right? And I think it's tangled up in a lot of different things, some things that we can see, some things that we can't necessarily see, some things that are common knowledge to our community, some things that are not common knowledge to our community. For students that are not necessarily out or haven't had that conversation with their families and the people that are going to support them either with paying for college or helping them to get to university, supporting their applications. How do students navigate those waters and think a little bit about prioritizing some of the things that you've shared here, but also wanting to have a search that still protects some element of their privacy and safety?
Yeah, and that is a complicated question as well. We increasingly see more and more students who have come out to some degree prior to the college admissions process. And for those students, it's a little bit easier. They might feel more comfortable declaring themselves to a college admissions officer, to a student at that college, to ask questions about that community and how they might fit there. And that is much more challenging, obviously, for a student who isn't yet comfortable asking all of those questions. And so one of the key things, I think, for those of us who work on the college admissions side is to see how we can signal to students who may not be out yet or may not be comfortable being out to everyone that we're a place where they can be themselves and they can thrive. And there's all sorts of tools to do that. I mean, I look at our publications, at our website, the emails we send, and I think about have we included students who identify as LGBTQ+? Have we included photos that might feature a pride flag because those hang around our campus? outside of student windows? Have we mentioned in our list of clubs that one of the clubs on our campus includes a very active LGBTQ plus group? And those kind of signals, I think, can be really important to those students who may not be comfortable asking the more forthright questions yet. That said, I mean, my biggest piece of advice for any student who's searching for that right community is, if they're comfortable, to ask those questions. And it's becoming increasingly common for me to have a student who comes, and it's happened for many years, of course. We've had students who come and ask about talking with a student who plays on the baseball team, or asking for a student who's majoring in philosophy. Increasingly, I see students coming and asking if they could talk to an LGBTQ plus student. And that's the kind of connection that we love to make within our admissions office. And if a student's comfortable asking for it, we don't have to inform anyone else in the world that that's what the student has asked for, but we can make that connection for them.
It's a great reminder that even from the early part of this process, as a prospective student, you're really creating a relationship with the campus, and that campus wants to be able to reflect some of that trust and honesty with respect to that relationship. And so I love that reminder that students can get out there and ask these kinds of questions, or ask for a resource in that particular space. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned in your response there around signals, right? So you've got a picture of a pride flag. Maybe you have some representation in your photos and your literature. And I think on the side of the college, the idea is we want to be as welcoming as possible. We want as many different groups of students to be able to see themselves in our community, because that's how we develop the most rich and diverse community that we can be. What do students look for with respect to those signals? And how can they dig a little bit more deeply to kind of understand whether those signals have depth and are not just about a photo and a piece of literature, but really reflect a commitment on the part of that college to sort of support their identity while they're on campus?
Yeah, so I think, one answer to that question is to ask those questions, to get out there if the student is comfortable and ask to speak with a student on campus, to ask very specific questions about what the LGBTQ plus community is like on that particular campus. But as you were noting, for many students, they might not feel comfortable doing that. And I think it is a matter then of looking at what kind of depth exists to the resources that have been put out there by the college. And it's no accident what a college puts out there to the world. If there are LGBT students who are writing blog posts, who are featured on Instagram accounts, those are real signals to students that there is substance to what we're doing here in this vein, even if beyond the idea of just having a student in a photo, or just the mention of a club in a particular list. And so looking for that additional level of depth is really important, but it also may depend on your identity and what resources you're searching for in your college. And so, for example, a cisgendered gay man may be looking for something very different in terms of resources than a person of color who may also identify as transgender. They may be for an LGBTQ resource center of some sort. A transgender student in particular might be looking for confirmation that they have the ability to be identified in college systems using the gender they identify with. And those are real specific needs that can vary based on the student, and you can get into much more detail about by trying to ask those questions if the student is comfortable.
Gotcha. So really encouraging those channels of communication to be open as often as possible.
Exactly. And like I said before, students may be at various stages of the coming out process.
Yes.
But we are under an obligation not to share personal student information with others outside of this admissions process. And so it is a perfectly okay thing to do if the student is comfortable to share with us something that they're looking for in their college, for us to find them those resources. But we aren't there to talk with the college counselor about that question. We aren't there to talk with parents about those questions. And so that there is a level of anonymity that can happen in this process, especially if the student is requesting that anonymity.
That's great. I want to come back to the essay writing process a little bit and just talk about how students can share aspects of that identity in the materials that are provided in the application. But because so many of our listeners are parents on this podcast, I wonder if you have advice for how parents might be able to support their kids through this particular part of the process, how they might show that they are encouraging of asking these questions, but also willing to give students space in that area, to not be overbearing and point out every single pride flag when they're on a campus tour, but also to reflect that they're there to support their kids. Do you have any advice for parents in that part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's wonderful to have parents who are supportive in this process. Yeah. Who, it's a different universe we live in today where that's something that's become the norm, where parents are going to be the ones pointing out the pride flag and encouraging students to look at a particular place because it's going to be a good fit for their LGBTQ plus student. So I think that's wonderful. In the same vein, just like actually with lots of other forms of identity and lots of other interests a student might have in a college, parents should take a back seat to the student and let the student drive the process. So they're finding the things they are looking for in that process, which may be very different from the things the parent thinks the student is looking for.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, and that I think is actually even more apparent in this, just in the last few years, as people have become more comfortable talking about their identities, and as there's kind of been an explosion of identities that people now are increasingly familiar with, but weren't just 5-10 years ago.
Sure. Yeah.
So it is not uncommon for me to hear a student talk about an identity they have that is important to them, that they're seeking in their college community, that I haven't heard of before. And that is, I think, part of my job, and it should be part of a counselor's job and a parent's job, to listen to students, to try to understand what they're asking for and what their needs are, and to go into it knowing that sometimes we're going to be caught off guard. We're not going to understand all the terms. We're going to have to learn those terms, and that should be a part of the process for us too, that listening and learning.
It's interesting because in many ways the kids are ahead of the adults in this space. They have these conversations. It's great to see. I have a 9 and an 8-year-old who are just perfectly comfortable introducing themselves with their pronouns. When I was 9 and 8, that was not a conversation topic at all, right? And so it's very interesting to see how things have changed over time, and really encouraging as well. Given that's the case, though, how do colleges create these kinds of signals and create an openness when sometimes there are identities that they are unfamiliar with or that they don't have as much experience with in part of this conversation? How do you as an enrollment manager keep up with those conversations that students are having between themselves?
Yeah, and part of that is us speaking directly to students. And so I meet regularly, not only with prospective students, but also our students on campus who are seeking to make our community a more diverse one and in our admissions process, because that's one of their goals too. Yeah. We also look at the diversity of the people who are in our own admissions staff. And so I deliberately am thinking that broadest of sense of diversity, having people of all different ages, all different backgrounds, students of different sexualities, gender identities, students who have come from different places around the world, who are Pell recipients, who are students of color, and putting that constellation of students together, of not just students, but of staff together, makes a big difference in how we go out into the world and represent ourselves as a college, and how we can communicate with prospective students. So that looking at the staff itself is a big question. In fact, at St. John's, we recently polled our staff and we looked at what kind of diversity was reflected amongst our group. And one of the most fascinating pieces of that was to see a real large LGBTQ plus representation amongst our own staff, over 30%. And that gives me a lot of faith that we are able to communicate with prospective students who are looking for that kind of community when they go to college.
That's terrific. And I think it also underscores that when you are in a really good place in terms of being welcoming and having that representation, that people have these identities, but they are also elevated for other aspects of their identities that are salient, right? You're reading about a biology research product from a student who happens to be bisexual. You're reading about, a really great economics discovery by a student who's transgendered, but they're not elevated because they're transgendered. They're being elevated because of their economics research. And so it's really fantastic when you see a school that is in that space. That's a great indication that those identities are welcomed.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it also informs our recruitment processes. I mean, we wrote, for instance, an email for Pride Month that went out to all of our prospective students. We have students on our staff. We have people on our staff who identify with the LGBTQ plus community writing that email, who are putting the things that they value into that email to communicate with prospective students. Similarly, when we look at our application itself, and that the application is a place where students should look carefully for those kind of signals, is the application giving an opportunity to identify the student's gender beyond a binary? That is a big clue about the kind of values that institution may have, and the conversations we have amongst our staff as we put together our application are influenced. The application itself is influenced by those conversations and by the diversity of the staff itself.
It's one of those trends that I've really liked seeing, especially in the last 5 to 10 years that I've been working at College Coach, is the number of colleges that are adding supplemental essay questions around aspects of inclusion, diversity, asking students to reflect on what they have to bring to a campus, and giving that space for students to step into that role. And I think sometimes, students who don't necessarily identify with these traditionally underrepresented groups might say, well, what do I have to share here? But you actually do. I mean, you've got an opportunity to talk about the way that you live an inclusive lifestyle and the way that you are welcoming of all differences in that space. I mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about the essay, and we've got a little bit of time to do that. I think sometimes I'll read that, I'll work with students that are a little reluctant to write about coming out or an aspect of their LGBTQ plus identity in a college admission essay. What's your advice for them? Is it a topic that has become cliche? I think some students worry about that. Like, I can't write the coming out essay because everybody's doing that these days. And, I cringe a little bit when I hear that because it feels like such an important growth moment for that student. What's your take as somebody who's, reading and reviewing these applications on the role that kind of essay can play in their process?
There's no doubt we see more students writing about their coming out process, about their identity in the college application than we saw a few years ago. So there's been an increase in that. It's still not the most common essay to read, though. And so I think to some degree, students can take a little heart in that. This is still a process that is very personal, that is revealing. Not every student wants to do it. Not every student is comfortable doing it. Not every student has that story to share. And so that is one element of this. But also, I think I understand where that anxiety comes from about, am I just telling the same story that other people are telling? And that is true, I think, a concern many people have in the college application process when writing these essays, not just about the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think the key there is to really stay true to yourselves and to dig into what that story is and to share something that is personal, that isn't reflective of everyone else's experience. And we all have those. And I think this is advice that's often given by college counselors, and I give it myself. Don't just tell the broad brushstrokes of a story. Don't just deliver a theme. Tell me an actual narrative. Give me the actual narrative. What happened to you? What are the things you care about most? Dig into that specific event and share that story, which really no one else can tell me. And it's that level of personalization that I think really transforms an essay from something that sounds like it could have been written by any number of students to the essay that really showcases how your voice is going to be a different voice within our community. And in the end, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that distinct voice, and the students have that voice. It's sometimes just a mechanism of the essay is a mechanism of expressing it, and sometimes a challenging one for that. But that's how I think students should see that essay, as merely a mechanism for expressing themselves.
I love when I hear advice from admissions professionals that is consistent with the advice that I'm giving students. So I think that was really great, especially thinking about how your experience might be different from other people who have a similar broad brush kind of experience. Your experience still is somewhat unique and differentiating, and especially essential to your identity. And it's helpful to share that. For a student who might say, I'm going to write my personal essay, but I'm not going to write about coming out because I have this other story I want to share. And I'm looking at these supplemental essays, and I don't really see that there's a space for me to share this aspect of my identity. Do you have any recommendations for how students might make admissions teams aware of something that is important to them, but doesn't necessarily fit into any of the boxes that is provided by an application?
Yeah, I would look at the whole application as telling a story. And so sometimes we become so fixated on just the common application personal essay or just one supplemental essay that we forget that the admissions officer on the other side of the desk is reading all of this material together at once and developing an image in their head of who this student is. And so it might be that the personal essay for the Common App or a supplemental essay asked for by a college isn't about one's identity in this respect. It's about some other important aspect of identity or belief or thought of some sort. you look for those other opportunities in the application to tell the broader story of who you are. That could be as simple as you're a member of an LGBTQ plus group in your high school, and so it's listed on your list of extracurricular activities. It might be that really there's no particular essay that addresses this part of your identity that's important. And so you're just going to take the opportunity in the additional information section of the Common App to write something there that is supplemental to everything else the college has asked for. And that's okay. I don't view this process as something I want to limit. I want students to share everything with me that encompasses who they are, even if that means breaking the boundaries of the application a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
To express it to the degree that maybe even the student says, I couldn't find a place in the application. I have something else to write in the additional information section of the Common App. So I'm going to send you an email with something I would like you to add to my file, because I think this picture of me is incomplete without it.
Very cool. I think that's great advice. It's good advice for all students, but I think especially here on Pride Month, it's a great advice for students that are LGBTQ plus, that they can think about how they're going to use those components of the application to bring their whole story alive. So Ben, it's been awesome to have you here on the show. I hope we can get you back to talk a little bit about St. John's. My wife and I, when we were on our honeymoon in Albuquerque, we went up to Santa Fe and stopped by the St. John's campus because we are college nerds. So it was great to see that campus there, and we'll be delighted to have you back to talk more about it.
Excellent. I'd love to talk about both Annapolis and Santa Fe and great books at St. John's next time I'm here.
Definitely. When we come back on this particular episode, we're going to answer some listener questions. So don't go away.